The summer darkness descends over the Lincolnshire coast on August 12, 1943. It is precisely 23 minutes past midnight. Somewhere beyond the gray churn of the North Sea, the German Luftwaffe has dispatched its bombers once again. They come without moonlight to guide them, without stars to navigate by. The British know they are coming. They always know. Ground observers track them on radar, but something far stranger is happening in the darkened operations room of a small research facility. In the absolute blackness of the night, technicians are watching the German aircraft move across a screen as if the aircraft themselves were burning with an internal fire. Not by radar, not by sound, but by the heat they shed into the night air itself. What they are witnessing is the future of warfare, and it will remain classified until the decade that gave us color television and Men on the Moon. This is the story of British infrared night vision technology, the invisible instrument that transformed nocturnal combat and remained Britain's most closely guarded secret for over 30 years. The Second World War created an imperative that seemed almost impossible to fulfill. The German Luftwaffe, having failed to destroy the Royal Air Force through daytime combat, had transformed itself into a night-bombing force of extraordinary sophistication. When darkness fell, the bombardiers could slip across the channel and reach their targets with comparative impunity. The British night fighter squadrons possessed one overwhelming disadvantage. They were flying blind. The best technology available in 1940 and 1941 was dependent on ground-based radar vectoring the fighter towards the enemy bomber, and then the pilot had to see his target visually before he could attack. On moonless nights, in cloud, or in conditions where the enemy aircraft was simply too distant, British pilots might as well have been flying with their eyes closed. The Luftwaffe's bombers ruled the darkness with near-total supremacy. Pilots like the redoubtable Heinz Schnell demonstrated that a skilled German crew flying into darkness could deliver devastating bombing runs on British cities and then vanish back into the night with minimal loss. German night bomber losses in 1942 and early 1943 were insignificant. The British night fighter force, by comparison, was engaged in a costly and frustrating endeavor. Between December 1940 and the end of 1941, night fighters destroyed fewer than 80 German aircraft despite dozens of sorties flown every evening. The mathematics of the situation were stark and demoralizing. Britain's cities were burning. The Luftwaffe's losses were negligible. The existing technology of radar and the human eye was insufficient to redress the balance. What was needed was something that would allow a British pilot to see in the darkness as if it were day. What was needed was a window into the infrared spectrum, that invisible realm of heat radiation that exists all around us, invisible to human eyes but potentially visible to the right kind of electronic eye. The solution did not emerge from the conventional research establishments. It came instead from the Combined Intelligence Priorities Committee and from classified work being conducted at a facility that barely appeared on any official map. The Telecommunications Research Establishment, based initially in Swanage and later relocated to Malvern, was already renowned for developing and refining radar technology. But within the highest circles of the scientific establishment, a parallel program was already underway. The Americans, collaborating closely with British scientists, had recognized that infrared radiation could potentially be detected and converted into visible images. Vladimir Zworykin, a Russian-born engineer working in America, had pioneered the fundamental research. But it was in Britain, in the austere laboratories hidden away from public view, that the concept was transformed from theoretical possibility into operational reality. The team, working under conditions of absolute secrecy, began to develop a system that could detect the infrared radiation emitted by aircraft engines and convert that radiation into an electrical signal that could then be displayed on a cathode ray tube. To the operator, it would appear as a moving point of light on a dark screen. To the pilot receiving the signal through radio communication, it would mean that for the first time in history, human beings might wage war in conditions of total darkness as if the sun had never set. The technical challenge was formidable. Infrared radiation is all around us, constantly emitted by every object whose temperature is above absolute zero. But detecting it and distinguishing a significant source from background noise required instrumentation of extraordinary sensitivity. The British engineers approached the problem in stages. The first requirement was a detector capable of responding to infrared radiation. They chose a lead sulfide photocell, a semiconductor device that would change its electrical resistance when exposed to infrared light. These photocells were extraordinarily sensitive but also extraordinarily fickle. They needed to be cooled to extremely low temperatures close to -70 degrees Celsius. The cooling was achieved through thermoelectric coolers, primitive but effective devices that allowed the photocell to operate at the necessary temperature. The signal from the photocell was then amplified through a series of electronic stages, producing an output that could drive a cathode ray tube display. The entire system, for an airborne installation, needed to fit within the confines of an aircraft fuselage, which meant miniaturization on a scale that pushed the boundaries of what was then possible with vacuum tube technology. The optical system, comprising a mirror and lens arrangement, needed to collect infrared radiation from aircraft engines at ranges of several kilometers whilst rejecting background radiation from the landscape below and the sky above. This selectivity was achieved through the use of rotating mirrors that scanned across the field of view, building up a picture of infrared sources within a defined sector of space. A complete airborne system weighed approximately 240 kilograms, which represented about 15% of the weight of a typical night fighter aircraft. The manufacturing process involved assembling these sensitive instruments in specially controlled environments. The production facilities were distributed across several locations to guard against intelligence leaks. Key components were fabricated at research establishments and specialist engineering firms, then assembled in secure facilities. By 1944, production had accelerated sufficiently that operational squadrons were beginning to receive systems. The early installations proved temperamental and unreliable, but they represented a genuine transformation in capability. A pilot equipped with infrared equipment could now detect an enemy bomber at night even in complete darkness, provided the bomber's engines were running. If you are finding this fascinating, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The first operational deployment came on October 26, 1944, when a Bristol Beaufighter fitted with an experimental infrared system encountered a German Junkers 88 night bomber over the North Sea. The Beaufighter's radar operator, relying on information derived from the infrared scanner, directed the pilot toward the target. In the absolute darkness of the night, with no visual reference available, the pilot closed to within 800 meters of the German aircraft before opening fire. The Junkers was damaged and subsequently crashed attempting to return to base. This engagement was not publicly reported at the time, and indeed the involvement of infrared equipment was carefully edited out of official records. Subsequent operations showed similarly impressive results. German night bombers, whose tactical superiority had rested on their ability to operate under darkness with impunity, suddenly found themselves vulnerable. The psychological impact on Luftwaffe crews was profound. Intelligence reports from captured German personnel revealed a growing conviction that the British possessed some form of supernatural ability to see in the darkness. German countermeasures were attempted. Some aircraft were fitted with infrared detection systems intended to warn crews that they were being scanned by British equipment, but these warning systems proved unreliable and consumed valuable power. The Germans attempted to develop their own infrared night vision systems, but the technical challenges proved insurmountable given the resources they could allocate and the deteriorating state of their research establishment as the war drew to a close. By 1945, infrared-equipped night fighters had accounted for dozens of confirmed kills against German bombers. The exact numbers remain somewhat unclear due to classification and the compartmentalization of the program, but estimates suggest that infrared-equipped aircraft destroyed between 30 and 60 German bombers in the final year of the war. More significantly, the knowledge that such technology existed changed the calculus of German night bombing operations. Fewer sorties were flown, and the Luftwaffe's offensive capability, already severely weakened by fighter losses and fuel shortages, was further degraded by the psychological pressure of operating against an enemy that could see them in the darkness. The American approach to infrared technology, developed in parallel with British work, followed a somewhat different path. The Americans, receiving British technical information through the FOIA declassified collaboration agreements, the American approach to infrared technology, developed in parallel with British work, followed a somewhat different path. The Americans, receiving British technical information through the FOIA declassified collaboration agreements, adopted a preference for more straightforward detection systems that could operate at higher temperatures, sacrificing sensitivity for reliability. American infrared systems, deployed initially on a small number of Pacific operations against Japanese aircraft, proved somewhat less effective than their British counterparts. The American systems required larger, heavier installation packages and depended on more conventional optical arrangements. The specific advantage of the British approach lay in the elegant use of rotating mirror scanning, which distributed the thermal load across the optical system and allowed for rapid scanning of a wide field of view. German efforts were more rudimentary still. Unable to access the theoretical knowledge that had been developed in the Western laboratories, and lacking the industrial capacity to manufacture sophisticated electronic components in the latter stages of the war, German attempts to develop operational infrared systems remained in the experimental stage throughout the war. The Luftwaffe's infrared research program, such as it was scattered across multiple research establishments and lacked the coordinated direction that had characterized British efforts. No German infrared night vision system ever entered operational service. The contrast between the three nations' approaches highlights a fundamental reality of the Second World War. Technological advantage accrues not simply to nations with theoretical knowledge, but to those with the industrial capacity, scientific coordination, and organizational capability to translate theory into practice and to deploy the resulting systems operationally before the war's conclusion. The historical impact of infrared night vision technology extended far beyond the Second World War itself. The successful deployment of infrared systems had demonstrated that nocturnal warfare need not be fought blind. This realization shaped the entire post-war development of air defense systems, and indeed, the broader direction of weapons development across all three military services. The British maintained their lead in infrared technology throughout the 1950s and 1960s, though the Cold War context meant that development proceeded in absolute secrecy. The technology that had been deployed against German bombers in 1944 and 1945 was refined, miniaturized, and adapted for application across a vast range of military systems. The material impact of infrared technology during the Second World War must be assessed carefully. The technology did not single-handedly turn the tide of the air war. The defeat of the German Luftwaffe resulted from a constellation of factors: the attrition of skilled pilots and crew members, the superior industrial capacity of Britain and America to replace losses, the strategic bombing campaign against German oil production and aircraft factories, and the relentless pressure of conventional fighter operations during daylight hours. The infrared night vision system was one weapon amongst many. However, the psychological impact was genuinely significant. German bomber crews, faced with an enemy that could seemingly see them in the darkness, became increasingly reluctant to undertake operations. The loss rates, whilst still manageable, rose sufficiently to influence decision-making at the highest levels of the German Air Command. More broadly, the technology established a principle that would dominate the remainder of the 20th century. The nation that could see beyond the visible spectrum possessed a decisive advantage in warfare. This principle would shape the development of intelligence and surveillance technology throughout the Cold War and beyond. The surviving examples of British infrared systems remain in museum collections, including pieces at the Science Museum in London and the RAF Museum at Hendon. though the public remained unaware of their significance until the technology was gradually declassified beginning in the 1970s. The secrecy surrounding infrared technology persisted long after the Second World War had ended. During the immediate post-war period, the British government classified all documentation relating to the infrared program with a secrecy rating that exceeded even that applied to radar. The fear of Soviet espionage and the desire to maintain a technological advantage during the emerging Cold War dictated that the full story remain hidden from public knowledge. The scientists and engineers who had developed the technology found themselves bound by the Official Secrets Act for decades. Survivors of the programs were frequently prohibited from discussing their work, even with family members. It was not until the mid-1970s that the government began to gradually allow declassification of certain aspects of the program. Even then, the release of information was grudging and incomplete. Full details of the infrared program remained classified in many cases well into the 1980s. The reason for this extraordinary durability of secrecy was straightforward. The British infrared technology that had been deployed against German bombers in 1944 and 1945 had formed the foundation of a continuous line of development that extended through the Cold War and beyond. By the time declassification began, British thermal imaging systems, night vision equipment, and infrared detection systems were at the cutting edge of military technology. Revealing the history of the wartime program and the continuous development pathway might compromise ongoing classified programs. Thus, what had been a closely guarded secret during the war remained sequestered from public knowledge for another 30 years. The engineers and scientists who had made the breakthrough gradually retired and passed away, taking with them the details of their extraordinary work. Their contributions were acknowledged only within classified circles. Their names appeared in declassified documents only decades after their deaths. The story of British infrared night vision technology reveals something profound about the nature of warfare and scientific innovation. The British scientists and engineers who developed this technology did so in conditions of absolute secrecy, driven by the urgent requirements of a nation engaged in a struggle for survival. They achieved something that the Germans, with all their vaunted technological prowess, could not match. They demonstrated that human ingenuity, properly organized and generously resourced, could create instruments of war that transcended the limitations that had seemed absolute. The German Luftwaffe had dominated the night sky for 2 years. Then, quite suddenly, that dominance was lost. British pilots could see in the darkness. German crews could not. The psychological shift was instantaneous and lasting. Yet the British government kept this victory hidden for 30 years. In the 1970s, when the technology was finally revealed to the public, infrared systems had already become routine in military applications. Thermal imaging cameras, night vision goggles, and infrared guidance systems had become commonplace in defense establishments across the Western world. The revelation that Britain had pioneered these technologies during the Second World War had significance mainly for historians and defense analysts. The general public, to whom the technology was now becoming gradually more visible through declassified photographs and official histories, could hardly appreciate what a profound transformation had occurred in the darkness of wartime nights over Britain and the North Sea. The invisible war, fought with invisible light, had been won in silence, and the victory had remained invisible even longer. But the technology that emerged from that invisible struggle would shape the entire course of the Cold War and beyond, giving to those who possessed it the gift of sight in the absolute darkness. It was, perhaps, the most profound technological advantage that one nation could possess over another, the ability to see what the enemy could not. Britain possessed that gift, and it remained their secret for longer than many nations kept atomic weapons classified.